Kate Mila-Balcha. Welcome back to Irish Granny Tarot. We're doing our Saturday book. This is video number 2. A Soul Remembers Hiroshima in honor of the anniversary of the August 6th, 1945 bombing of Hiroshima and the 9th bombing of Nagasaki. So, chapter 12, Wartime in Hiroshima. Oh, this is video 2. You'll want to watch video 1 if you haven't already. So Dolores Cannon was upset by this description of wartime Japan. This is not the story that Americans were told. And she had been alive. She was young and little, but she paid attention and knew that this is not what people talked about. This is not how people felt about Japan or the bombings. And she now knew that Americans had been propagandized, and it had been to minimize the horror of the war that was visited upon the Japanese people. They had been told the Japanese were the enemy, that they were monsters, that they didn't think or feel the way Americans did. And I know that for a fact because I can't remember who it was, but I saw a newsreel type film and an American in a uniform, and I don't know if he was a government official or a military official, talking about these Japanese, essentially saying they're not human without actually quoting that. His words, not mine. So she'd never questioned as a child and as an adult growing up, because of how America had been propagandized, she never questioned, did the United States do the right thing? Sorry. It's my eye I tried to poke out. But now she had big-time questions about the motivation of the U.S. and what was going on with that. She needed to believe that we had not known anything at all about the domestic situation in Japan, because Americans were led to believe that the entire population of Japanese people were rabidly anti-American and pro-war and ready to fight to the death. However, these regression stories validated that Katie was not inventing the story, because why would she invent something that was counterfactual to what the historical record said? So back in trance, it's the winter of 1944, and he's living mostly in Hiroshima. He visits his house in the village once in a while. It's a 3-day walk. He hides from soldiers on the road. Cannon realized that he was forced to live in Hiroshima because of the lack of food and also because he was lonely. So his daughters-in-law live in 2 rooms in factory housing, which is very difficult for him to be away from the farm. The government hands out rations for those who are working for the government, and the rations are really not enough, but they're sharing with him. And he finds out people have stolen parts of his house for the wood to make fires. And what they didn't burn, they just took. And he has nothing left to sell. And he says no one wants to buy pottery, art. And he won't sell his wife's heirloom jewelry. He has it buried. The military is moving its headquarters. It was sort of observing from a height, the mountains. They're moving closer into the town of Hiroshima. And his question is, what good can come from destroying people's lives? Most people are confused, but they're afraid to speak out. They're kind of used to a culture of some conformity. And women, of course, absolutely were not allowed an opinion anyway. So that's 50% of the population has no model for speaking out. And any dissidents that dare are hanged or shot. And the people are absolutely ruled by terror, the iron hand of the military. His daughters-in-law are not paid with money. They're paid with scrip, which is a government-issued, military-issued fake money, and it's only good for using on the military base. You can only buy from the military, or you can barter and trade with it in the marketplace. It's a way to control people. And if you speak out, then they just cut off your supplies. So he says, freedom is a state of mind. And because survival is now a day-to-day struggle, he can't ignore anymore that this political stuff is going on, that problems exist. Only when it has become so severe do people wake up and realize they've lost everything. I'm going to read that again because this is what he said. Only when it has become so severe do people wake up and realize they've lost everything. Government doesn't care about the survival of the population. They believe they'll win and they'll have control of everything. Some people barter and make their own stuff, and they won't work for the government. There are tons of military and factory jobs. There are Catholic and Lutheran missionaries who try to help, and the Red Cross who tries to help. And I wrote, not because they're religious, but despite it. And Cannon researches this later. She's surprised to hear this. She researches it later and learns that the Red Cross sent help to the population. She asks, does the United States government know all this? And he says, knowing and caring are two very different things. Governments want to win. They don't care about the cost. He complains of tiredness. He says he's soul weary. And she ends the session. She told Katie that they were at the end of the road as far as these sessions go. There was only one direction left to go, which was the day of the bomb. And Cannon believed these sessions had helped to ease Katie's sense of trauma and sadness in this life. It had been therapeutic for her. And Cannon promised, let's try it once, and if it's too hard, we don't have to proceed or do it again. So, chapter 13, the atomic bomb. Katie wanted to proceed. She knew it was important to her well-being to experience it, and she knew she could not run from it because she was carrying that trauma with her. And Cannon says that's true bravery, doing something that terrifies us. So she was nervous. Cannon was nervous because this is a unique experience, this whole, past life. And Katie knew what the outcome was going to be. Who really knew what it was like to die in an atomic bomb attack, So when put into a trance, Cannon took extra precautions to give her protection and guides and guardian angels just to make it as good as it could be. So the tape is very emotional because she records all this. And the tape, she says, is really hard to listen to, very emotional. And he says to them, do not let this madness happen again. So the spring of 45, he sees planes stalking us, huge planes, 4 or 5, not ours. And why? Are they looking for a place to bomb? And here's the thing. I thought this was just so cynical. Other areas had been bombed, and the governments had not really informed the people who didn't live there to the extent of this bombing. There was the firebombing of large cities. Tokyo was just brought to rubble. Most large cities were firebombed and other kind of bombs to the point where there was absolutely nothing left. But there were several cities that were left completely untouched, which was weird because, Hiroshima was a port and Hiroshima was a factory town. You think that would make it a target. Well, they were intentionally, and this all came out, this is a fact, this all came out after the war. They were earmarked to be left alone because should they finally succeed in getting this bomb to work, they wanted a town that had been untouched by anything else so they could take credit for all the damage and see, look, this is what this bomb can do. It did all this damage. So the government thought that the war would be over before they actually ever got to do this. people were afraid anyway because, foreign planes would go overhead. So every time these planes would go overhead, sirens would sound and they would run to underground shelters. And some of them were just basements and, not all that protective. Many people eventually got tired of this because there'd be no bombing and it would disrupt their day. And it was often early in the morning, so they're getting ready to go to school and work. And during rush hour, they would have to go into a bomb shelter. And many would ignore the planes and go about their business. So the planes would go overhead. And unbeknownst to these people, these were weather planes. They were tracking the weather to determine the right time to bomb. And the sirens would signal all clear. And, well, first the sirens would signal, go into the bomb shelter. And he said he never really hurried out of the street because he wanted to see what kills me, is how he put it. But then when it was all over, the plane had gone by, they'd signal all clear, people would come out, and it would be a huge rush hour because everybody was now late for work and school and whatever. He says he didn't go back to his house anymore in the country. It was too dangerous. He felt like a caged bird in the city. He couldn't take walks because if you did, you got stopped at these checkpoints by soldiers who would stop you and question you and, rough you up if they didn't kill you. So she asked him to move forward to July. Things were worse. Bombing had happened around the periphery of the city, and including the factories outside the city in the mountains, and everybody was worried and tense. And he says the bombs had a shrill whistle. It was eerie. Planes would come early every morning, and he said it was just really difficult to ignore them. Some people could, but he couldn't. He said the army didn't even fire their guns at them anymore, and it turns out they didn't fire their guns because they were running out of ammunition, which she was able to show as a fact later. She said that these soldiers were young, and they hardly fired at them, acted like the whole thing was a joke. And he wasn't getting any news. The people were not really getting news anymore. And sometimes they'd go to the bomb shelter, but he said people were now getting to the point where they wouldn't, and some would set their clocks by the planes going overhead. He suspects that the enemy is doing this in a plan to lull them because something is coming up. He was absolutely right. It's like the boy who cries wolf, kind of. They would get so used to seeing them that they would not feel in danger. His daughters-in-law believed everything that they were told, as most people did, that America was not strong enough to fight Japan, and they don't want to bomb us, and the war is almost over, and we really aren't fighting anymore. And he said the grandkids liked to watch the planes, but food was scarce, rations were short. If lucky, you might be able to find something in the market. He would grow his own sprouts when he could find beans, just to have something green to eat. He would go to find fruit and nuts to trade, or trade blankets. So money no longer had any value at all. And the government was passing out rations maybe twice a week at work. So she took Katie to August 6th, and she says that Katie turned white as a sheet and stiffened and seemed confused and tried to talk but could only gasp, was in shock. The old man's voice shook. He started to tremble and sounded very different from what he'd sounded in the past. And Dolores Cannon said she had to pretend she didn't know why he was reacting this way and asked what happened. He said, well, I was in the market and there was a great flash and a wind like a fire, and people fell down and just laid there. He said it was blinding white light and a boom, and a giant cloud went straight up, and hot wind rolled in, and people were dying everywhere, but he didn't know why. He was in shock. And Cannon says, well, what's happened? And she reassured him that it helpful for him to talk about it and describe what had happened. And this is what he responded. I don't know. It's hard to hear anything but the screams. Those who can are running. People are falling down. Some just stumbling around, holding their arms out. And Katie's shock was kind of rising to a panic. Everything is gone. It's been destroyed. Buildings as if they'd never been there. There's nothing left. Why? Cannon says, are you by yourself or with your daughters? He says, I'm alone, and seems bewildered. I don't know where anyone is. Everything is gone. The city is as if there is no center to the city. It's gone. The buildings have disappeared. There's nothing but rubble and screams. Cannon says, even as I write these words, I can hear again the complete horror in Katie's voice. I had to keep myself from being caught up in this. Only by remaining objective would I be able to monitor her and think of questions to ask. So, question, where's the market located? It was by one of the entrances into the town. It was away from the center. Cannon says, you said the cloud rose straight up and then the winds came. Is that when the buildings began to disappear? She said, yes, and the people fell. People just died. Did the buildings disappear when the cloud hit or the wind hit? Some of both. Some when the cloud hit, they disappeared at that moment. Some the great wind knocked everything to the ground. All of the people. He paused as if having difficulty in completing the sentences. She asks, did you fall down? And he says, yes, it shrieked. I could not tell if it was people screaming or if it was the noise. I don't know. All I know is everyone is dying. His voice trailed off in a painful whisper. So then he realized finally that his hands were burned black. And later, Cannon learned that the burns would be so deep that they would damage the nerves and they wouldn't feel pain. And he said his face felt like he had no skin on it. So he says they stumbled and fell and wandered. Many people were wandering around in shock and pain, injured. And everything was gone. He says, gone where? Where is everything? He said he just wanted to get away from the horror. He realized it must have been a bomb from the planes that had gone over. And he asks, do they know what they've done? Do they care? They've killed a whole town. It's gone. I feel like my insides are on fire, like a bonfire. And Cannon suggests it's probably from breathing the hot air. He said he had trouble seeing, and she couldn't figure out, well, is he having trouble seeing because his eyes are injured, or is it because he's in shock and it's kind of a psychological self-protection? He was so upset, despite everything, that Cannon tried, that she moved forward a week. He says, I'm in a building that cares for those of us who are dying. Hundreds of people are slowly dying. He has not seen his family. He says they're probably dead, and it would have been merciful to have died at once. All the staff can do is to give pain meds, and they don't help. Cannon says the Americans were told that the United States dropped leaflets telling the people to leave the city beforehand, and he has not heard this. Was this a lie that was told to Americans? Actually, she found out later that they did drop leaflets about some bombings, but they didn't drop them everywhere, and they didn't drop them every time. So Cannon moved him out of that period of time, and Katie immediately relaxed and her color improved. And she took Katie to what happened in the end. She wanted to take her away from the bombing and back to a happier time in the early 30s. And then his voice sounds younger and happier. He's working on pots that are unique and beautiful, and he was content and proud of his work. And she says, well, keep those happy memories. She later discovered that when Katie's soul died in Hiroshima, that she went to a resting place. She got rid of a lot of the karma with her lingering death. The old man's death went on for 9 days. And Katie's soul went to a spirit school to evaluate and learn from that life. And then was called to enter Katie, to step in. A week after their last session, she felt great, and her whole outlook on life changed, Katie's, and she began to mature very quickly. Chapter 14, Research. So going to these sessions, Cannon knew very little about Japan, Hiroshima, or the bomb. She knew what she'd heard as a child, but, So she said it was time to fact check. The end of the war was a great time of celebration for America. No one thought anything about the suffering of the Japanese people. And they were just glad that men were going to come home and invasion had been avoided. Then the stories of the radiation and everything, it became a black mark on American history, so how could we do such a terrible thing? Cannon discovered very little research was done on the experience that day or the after effects. And as I promised, it's not in the book, this is me. As I promised, we're going to talk about that at length. Not today, but at length. There's lots to know about the Enola Gay, the name of the American airplane and the crew, but nothing about the Japanese people. There's the Hiroshima book by John Hersey. There's a book called Hiroshima Diary by Hakbia. Research began after the war was abandoned because of the horror of it. People couldn't cope. And I've got other stuff to tell you about that in the session that we will get to. There's a book called Death in Life by Robert Lifton that was written 20 years later. The Japanese were afraid if they talked that the United States would use the information to make worse bombs. I could see that. Lifton and Dolores Cannon both had trouble dealing with their research. It was so awful. And she said it was just things that revolt and revulse the human soul. She said Katie got the facts right. The emperor didn't want war. Power-hungry general in the military did. And after it began through a program of propaganda, Japan became fanatical about winning. There were the militarists who were into it, the nationalism part, and they imposed this on the people. And even as the population was suffering, the military would not relent. Everybody in the country was forced into labor for the war that was needed to build planes. Blockades had prevented supply ships, and the Americans knew that they had created the situation, and they intentionally blockaded Japan, forcing the situation to be worse. The only productions that they had in the country were war stuff, so American bombing, meanwhile, stopped the trains, and the raw materials couldn't get anywhere to do production, but also for the people. Hiroshima was the target because many factories and major shipping port and a major place to send off troops to go to war. They would leave from Hiroshima. But the Americans mined the harbor. They mined the harbor, but not the port and not troop transports. It's interesting. They kind of allowed some stuff and not others. The government knew that starvation was coming, and the Americans found this to be true. The country was falling apart domestically, and the people were living on nothing but false hope. The military had participated in conventional bombing, the Japanese military, and destroyed houses to create fire breaks and fire lanes, and they drafted labor to do it. They would draft people to destroy their own houses under gunpoint. Women and older children tore down the houses, 70,000 of them, for fear of the incendiary bombs. So there were homeless people. Many children lived in factory dorms and went to classes every day and then to work, enforced child labor. People were forced to work. There were 5 mass evacuations 90,000 people at one point because the houses that they lived in were intentionally destroyed. But numbers of who died, they have the official numbers, but they're not accurate. We often don't hear this. They were probably much higher. And the reason why they were much higher is because so many people from other firebombed places and from destitute areas of the countryside came looking for food and work and shelter, that there were refugees from all over pouring into the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they were never counted in the death numbers. Roadblocks were set up to stop unauthorized evacuees from leaving the city. And that's why he couldn't go to his farm. They weren't allowed to leave. And Hiroshima had been barely bombed and had not been firebombed at all, just a few bombs on the outskirts. Planes did fly over on regular schedules, day and night, and it was to give people a false sense of security. They knew this. The people knew that they'd been spared, and they feared why, and they expected bad things to come. And they used to joke, oh, well, Hiroshima's not on any American maps. I don't know if you can hear that music. I hope you can't. That's my bird singing along to the soundtrack to Chicago. Okay. This is a quote from Death in Life. Many use the Japanese word bukimi, meaning weird, ghastly, or unearthly, to describe Hiroshima's uneasy combination of continued good fortune and expectation of catastrophe. People remembered saying to one another, will it be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow? This was the atmosphere Nagorigatu described. Another quote from No High Ground. There were those in Hiroshima describing themselves as intellectuals who feared as they lay awake at night listening to the planes overhead that the Yankees were saving them for some particular dreadful fate. Americans agreed to make a maximum imprint on Japan by using this new atomic bomb on an untouched city, but there were very few left that weren't in rubble. The air raid sirens and then no bombing so often was crying wolf, and the people were lulled into a false sense of security. And they aimed the bomb in Hiroshima for the center of town during rush hour, and they manipulated the maximum number of civilians on the streets when they dropped the bomb. That's a fact. So those planes that went overhead, they weren't even bombers, they were weather planes. Like I said, they were tracking the weather and lulling the population, and it was intentional. Cannon found that leaflets were dropped elsewhere warning people of conventional bombs, but none were dropped in Hiroshima. This was the best kept secret of the war. There were 2 false alarms in very early morning of August 6th. One very, very high up, B-29 at 7 a.m. flew over twice and then left. That was a weather plane. All clear was called, and a half hour later, the bomb was dropped during rush hour. 20,000 tons of TNT at the center. It was 1 million degrees Fahrenheit, like a piece of the sun had been dropped in the heart of town. The city itself was spread like 5 fingers of a hand, of the left hand, with the rivers between the fingers. So there were lots of bridges between all these waterways. The bomb hit on the wedding ring area, and it hit a surgical hospital dead on. And it was the intended target. Katie's description was 100% correct. A bright flash, burning heat, huge boom, violent wind and noise, a huge cloud that climbed and hung horizontally like a mushroom with a tornado for a stem. Survivors were called Picadon. Oh, no, survivors called the bomb Picadon, a flash boom. Pica, the flash, was at the center, and the dawn, the boom, was further out. And what they could remember about the Picadon, the flash and the boom, was an indication of where they were from the center of the bombing when the bomb hit. He saw the flash and heard the boom in the market several miles from the bomb center. In the first instant, the heat was so intense it melted stone and tile and metal. It incinerated people and left only their shadow on the ground. He was 2.5 miles away, close to the center of the bomb, and this is where bare skin burned. Clothing patterns burned onto skin. Anyone outside got severe burns. The blast winds that came were 500 miles an hour, like 5 hurricanes. Within 2 miles of the center of the bomb was total destruction and death. All buildings within 3 miles were devastated. Thousands were killed by the debris of collapsing buildings. Those further from the center, inside reinforced concrete, got the most protection. A few office buildings were built to withstand earthquakes, and they stood, but their roofs were driven down and anyone inside was destroyed. The fires in many places, all at the same time, every building within a 5-mile radius was completely gone. There were only a few skeletons left of buildings. Then there was a strange black rain and then huge black dust clouds that turned the day to night, and it's probably why he wasn't able to see. Then there was a great fire wind that blew from the fires back towards the bomb center. So they get the wind from the bomb and then the firestorm that came after. This wind uprooted large trees. Okay. This is a quote from Hiroshima and Nagasaki Reconsidered by Barton J. Bernstein. According to a British study, eyewitnesses agreed they saw a blinding white flash in the sky, felt a rush of air, and heard a loud rumble of noise, followed by the sound of rending and the falling of buildings. All spoke of the settling darkness as they found themselves enveloped by a universal cloud of dust. Men, women, and children were torn to pieces, and the smell of burned flesh and the memory of agonized cries lingered. Others died from radiation, some quickly, some slowly. Most of the industrial workers had already reported to work, but many workers were en route, and nearly all the school children and some industrial employees were at work in the open. Survivors have described their shock upon looking toward the center of the city after smoke and dust cleared and finding that it had completely disappeared, wiped out in an instant. Even observers who later flew over the area remarked about this strange total devastation, unlike anything they had ever seen before in wartime bombing. A quote from a survivor. I saw that Hiroshima had disappeared. I was shocked by the sight. What I felt then and still feel now, I just can't explain with words. Seeing nothing left of Hiroshima was so shocking that I simply can't express what I felt. I could see a few buildings standing, but Hiroshima did not exist. That was mainly what I saw. Hiroshima did not exist. A quote from Dr. Hakiya's Hiroshima diary. For acres and acres, the city was like a desert except for scattered piles of brick and roof tiles. I had to revise my meaning of the word destruction or choose some other word to describe what I saw. Devastation may be a better word, but really I know of no word or words to describe that view. The feeling I had was that everyone was dead. The whole city was destroyed. I thought this was the end of Hiroshima, of Japan, of humankind. The feeling was the whole world was dying, a complete immersion in death. Okay. The survivors were confused, helpless, felt abandoned. Nogoragatu said it was like our sun had come down. Cannon knew that Katie had not researched this. I mean, it's really difficult to get this information. And when we do our session that I'm going to do probably Monday, you will understand that more. The Americans and the Japanese did not agree on the number of dead. As I said, the Japanese said that 60% of the population was in a 1.2 miles of the center, so they were killed. Many, many more people were in the city that weren't counted, like Norigatu. I mean, he wasn't counted. They say 50% of the population, or more than 200,000, were dead, but that's the official. But research indicates it was probably closer to an estimated 400,000 people, including day workers. The Americans thought the population would use the air raid shelters. Also, they didn't count on the radiation being as bad as it was. His description of people wandering with arms out was true. Many were in shock and blinded, and their arms were out because they were blinded, or also because their skin was hanging and it was painful. And they would wander onto bridges and get pushed off and drown in the rivers. The eyewitnesses came and saw long lines of wanderers burned completely black and wandering around. Their arms were out because they were burned. They had no hair. They had no skin on many, and some of them, their skin hung in strips. Many died along the roads. They were like walking ghosts or automatons, disassociated with shock. There was only one doctor left in all of Hiroshima because the hospitals had all been hit and destroyed, and their staff was completely gone. They set up makeshift hospitals in shells of buildings or in outside areas outside the blast zone. Eventually, they got 28 doctors together from the outside, but no doctors survived from the inside except that one doctor. There were sick and dying people everywhere. They had no supplies. They had no people to help. They had nobody trained. Those who didn't die of their burns or infection ended up with radiation sickness, hemorrhaging, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and there was nothing to treat them with. For the survivors, it was an ongoing living nightmare. And to make it even worse, the effects of radiation were passed on genetically. Chapter 15, finale. Katie had felt trauma with her original memories of Hiroshima and extreme relief at the end of these sessions. Surely this wasn't from her conscious mind. Didn't matter what the explanation, whatever was going on, this process helped her. And Cannon said it gives us a new perspective of World War II. We see now how people of both sides were manipulated into seeing the other as monsters. No one was a monster, or everyone was. Japanese people just wanted peaceful everyday life with no war. They were not into the war. Innocent people were unwilling pawns in the hands of the military and the government, power grabbers, the injustice of war. If left to individuals, there wouldn't be a war. Nogoragatu said that he didn't bomb Pearl Harbor. He had nothing to do with that, no knowledge of it. And Cannon said, the Hiroshima bomb was a very complex issue. People needed to villainize the enemy and keep the enemy faceless. And if you know him as a person, you don't want to fight. It's not easy to go back and face the harsh reality of what really happened. We haven't. We have not. Absolutely not. The government of Japan is afraid of people rising up and was afraid of people rising up. And therefore, there were soldiers everywhere. And dissidents were immediately punished. The people had no voice. This was not a population that was angry at the United States and wanted to go after them. That was the farthest thing from the truth. Japanese people were starving, and they weren't interested in fighting to the last man, as Americans were told. Cannon believes that the bombs were not needed. And that's actually an opinion that we're going to talk about. She said Japan was already falling apart. We knew it. The American government knew it and did it anyway. Japan had tried to surrender several times in the summer of 1945, and the Americans avoided the surrender. Need to remember that. In 1939, escaped German scientists told Roosevelt that Germany was developing a bomb. And FDR told them to do it for the United States. At the time, the United States was isolationist. But they had to keep up with the Nazis. And in 1941, they began all-out research to use against Germany. And they spent more than $2 billion. 1940s, $2 billion. Dark money. Where did it come from? FDR was not fond of the Soviets and said we needed the bomb. Didn't want to tell the Russians. They worked together for a little while, and then when it looked like the Americans were making progress, they started keeping it secret from their allies, the Russians. Churchill knew, and then that little romance fell apart. 1 hour after he was sworn in, Truman was told that the Germans and the Japanese were not our problem, that the Soviets were. This is 1 hour after he was sworn in. He was pressured to continue research and development on the bomb because of the money that had already been spent, because of grabbing future power for the United States, and because they wanted to see if it would work. Hey, we design these things. Let's play with our new toys. This is the truth. Then Germany surrendered. Big disappointment for a lot of bomb makers. So they had to hurry to use the bomb before the Japanese did, and they wouldn't let the Japanese surrender. So the question is, were the Japanese guinea pigs? Was this an act of strength to intimidate Russia? And did they just hope that the world would consider the warnings and everything that the United States gave out? If they did warnings and demonstrations instead of dropping the bomb, would the world think, oh, this is just American propaganda? Oppenheimer refused to do demonstrations to get the Japanese to surrender. Japanese were trying to surrender. Meanwhile, they talked about this huge preparation going on for an invasion of Japan. The plan was, if they didn't get the bomb working, they would do aerial bombing from March to November and invade in the south of Japan by November and land near Tokyo by the spring of 1946. So in March of 45, they began these mass civilian bombings. And for example, March 9th, 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs were dropped on Tokyo, setting the entire city apart, women and children almost entirely, because all of the men were in the military, and 78,000 people died that day. There's much debate in government and the military. Do we do an invasion? Do we do a bomb? And some said, well, we're winning, and Japan, it's on its knees because of the bombings and the blockades, and we don't need either an invasion nor a bomb. All we have to do is just wait them out. July 12th, 150 scientists were polled. And their answer was, this is 1945, their answer was, do a demonstration for the Japanese and they will surrender. This was rejected for the choice to drop the bomb as revenge for Pearl Harbor. They didn't want to waste all the money on research and development, and they were curious to see if it would work. They knew that the biggest imprint on people would be to bomb them and to do it in an unbombed city to convince Japan of its destructive power and as a warning to the Russians, important part. And Hiroshima was untouched, essentially, and had no POW camp. Leaflets warning to evacuate were dropped on 4 other cities right beforehand, but not on Hiroshima. When incendiary bombs were dropped, leaflets had been dropped, and the planes met with no resistance because there was no ammunition. Later, they discovered a huge shortage of ammunition. The leaflets did not mention an A-bomb, and people were sick of getting these pieces of propaganda from the sky and paid no attention to them. And as a matter of fact, if you were caught reading them, you would be in trouble for negatively affecting morale, conspiring with the enemy, spreading disinformation. Just by picking a leaflet off the ground and reading it, you could be shot as a Japanese person. So we did not show any kind of humanitarian concern for the people of Hiroshima. We set up a situation of the boy who cried wolf. We timed it for rush hour with the maximum number of people outside for the maximum number of deaths. And because of the blockades, Japan's naval battleships would not have had the fuel to return home. And they sank, because they were bombed in the water, and they were out of fuel anyway, and they had no raw materials because of the bombings of the railroads. And what we're talking about here is Japan's ability to continue the fight. This was just not going to happen. They were at the end. They were making bullet casings from bamboo and handing out spears to military trainees and to what they call their volunteer defense corps, kids, women, old men. Soldiers were told to go collect scrap metal from home when on leave. The shore of Japan was defended only with barbed wire. They couldn't defend their beaches at all. The Air Force was now composed of kamikaze flyers. The Navy had begun loading small boats with explosives for one-way voyages and sacrificing the crews. And these are not people who wanted to do this. These are people conscripted and forced to do it. From early 45, Japan tried to surrender. Allen Dulles of the OSS was approached for surrender, and the Soviets were asked by the Japanese to be an intermediary for surrender, and the message didn't get passed on to the Americans. And they later discovered that Russia was on the fence, and they weren't willing to commit one way or the other. They weren't going to act as intermediaries. They're going to wait and see what happened. They wanted to delay their own entry into the Pacific War as long as possible, and they wanted the U.S. to do all the dirty work. Russia declared war on Japan days after the atomic bombs were dropped. The emperor was pushing for surrender. He never wanted a war. He was ordered to continue it by the military. He sent an envoy to Moscow to ask for peace, and the Russians refused to help a loser. That's a quote. And this is not something that people hear. I've always been told, well, they had no choice because they were going to lose so many Americans in an invasion. And that's actually completely untrue. From the atomic bomb and the end of World War II by Herbert Feist, their reliance on the goodwill of the Soviets up to the end was one of the main causes of the ultimate Japanese tragedy. Japan's main condition of surrender was to keep the emperor as a figurehead, a deity. America had codes. They knew all of this. Even in the New York Times in July of 1945, one American suggested send representatives to the coast of China to meet with the Japanese and broker a peace. July 16th was the first plutonium bomb test in New Mexico. They did not know. It was done in the desert. They had no idea how it would affect cities and people. The original fear was that the bomb would consume the earth. Nobody knew about radiation sickness. Eisenhower and 6 of the very top brass in the military said, no, let's not do this. But Truman's advisors and the scientists pushed for it. July 26th, an ultimatum was sent, but they didn't, to the Japanese, but they didn't discuss the emperor. Japan ordered the emperor, do not surrender. This was the last warning. Potsdam, Stalin misrepresented their position with Japan and the surrender. He did not tell the Americans Japan had come to the Russians to try to broker a surrender. The Enola Gay, I can't believe it's it's all warm and fuzzy and named after his mom. The Enola Gay was ready. The weather planes had set the people up for not to react. The bomb hit at breakfast. There were fires going for breakfast everywhere. It hit at rush hour, and the all clear had been sounded because the weather plane had left. The radiation was completely unexpected in its lethality. Japanese officials were slow to surrender, so the Allies just didn't care. They went ahead and dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. Hiroshima was a tragedy. This is a quote. Hiroshima was a tragedy. Nagasaki was a war crime. I would argue they both were. So I'm going to read this. I can't keep my opinions to myself. Truman promised to destroy much of Japan if her leaders did not surrender. He said they could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Only 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing 40,000 and injuring 60,000. Remember that these numbers are abysmally low. It also destroyed a POW camp, killing at least 16 prisoners. But strangely, if the bombardier had erred about 3 miles south, he would have destroyed a larger POW camp containing more than 1,400 Allied prisoners that military intelligence did not even know existed. Another bomb was planned for Tokyo. Quote from Hiroshima and Nagasaki reconsidered by Bernstein. Truman wrote shortly after Nagasaki, "Nobody is more disturbed over the use of atomic bombs than I am, but I was greatly disturbed over the unwarranted attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor and the murder of our prisoners of war. The only language they seem to understand is the one we have been using to bombard them. When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him as a beast. It is most regrettable, but nevertheless true." No mention of the rejected attempt to surrender. Japan was frantically trying to surrender. So why did they bomb Nagasaki? Japan surrendered August 10th. The U.S. Air Force kept bombing Japan after that. August 14th, more than 1,000 bombers in a show of U.S. strength bombed Japan as they were attempting to surrender. Hiroshima was a tragic U.S. flub to needlessly vaporize 140,000 people. It was more than that. There's no difference between the fire bombs of Tokyo, killing 78,000, and the A-bomb of Hiroshima, killing however many it killed, because both of them were essentially unnecessary and innocent deaths. Memories fade. Talk of limited nuclear war now exists, that it's survivable. And the question is this a massive, expensive scientific experiment that happened here? Einstein and Freud both decried the bomb and the war. Herbert Hoover said he was revolted. The government makes war, not people. And nobody wins. And the question begs to be asked, was this done for revenge? Truman had no regrets. Remember our book, Kings, Conquerors, Psychopaths? He said it was foolish not to use it to win. And later it was said that the atomic bomb saved money. You thought I was going to say lives, right? It saved money. So by all means, right? This is from No High Ground. Chaplain William Downey, stationed in Tinian Island when the Enola Gay took off, and he said the quantity of killing is not the issue. The wrong is the killing, whether by firebombs from hundreds of planes, by one atomic bomb, or by a single rifle bullet. War itself is the evil that man must conquer. Canon began with an exploration of reincarnation and ended with an anti-war statement from beyond the grave, really. And was this Katie's purpose in this lifetime? This is a lesson for humanity. And the book ends with, May Nogurigatu and all those who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki rest in peace. And as I said, that's the end of the book. As I said, a lot of talk about the movie here, Oppenheimer. A lot of talk about Putin's threats. Not nearly enough talk about the killing, the deaths, the bomb, the morality of choices, governments, psychopathic choices. And we're going to talk about all of that here coming up in a couple of days. So, that's the end of the book. And I hope we all take time to pause and reflect this weekend on the people of Hiroshima, the people of Nagasaki. There's a great movie made in the 90s, Hiroshima, Out of the Ashes. It's just a fictionalization. I think it's very good. It's got Max von Sydow, and I really like him. There's White Light, White Flash, White Light, Black Rain. It's very good too. And we're going to talk quite a bit about movies that exist about this, or better yet, movies that don't exist about this. So that's all I have for a book this weekend. I'm sorry if it's a bummer, but I could not let this day go by without talking about it. Thank you very much for watching. I've gotten kind of a flurry of new subscribers. I have no idea how that happened. I'm thrilled. Thank you very, very, very much. I hope you will return. We often do fun books too, I promise. So, and I'm accepting suggestions at all times. So, in the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and slán go fóill, slánte.